Hello, and welcome to another edition of On the Hill Media. I'm Fossey Weston, and today we have our guest from District 27A candidate for delegate, Mr. Mike Hethmon. Mike, how are you doing today?
Glad to be here, Fossey.
I'm glad to be here too. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Fossey. I'm a public interest lawyer working for an advocacy group called the Immigration Reform Law Institute. And that is the only public interest law firm in the country that focuses on representing citizens in immigration-related issues and problems. Mm-hmm. And we work around the country, from Annapolis in Maryland right out to California, a number of different states. You may have heard of the Arizona law. Oh, yes. That's one of the kind of products that we work on. Legislators call us from around the country saying, we're concerned about the immigration issue. We want to do something at the state level, but we understand that there are real constitutional issues. And so how can we carry out these policy reforms to protect the citizens, protect the taxpayers, but not run afoul of the civil liberties and civil rights of not only the American people, but immigrants to this country.
What do you think you can bring to 27A and the Maryland General Assembly?
I think I will bring a breath of fresh air, a knowledge of how to write laws well, and a willingness to work for change in Maryland in the same way that I have worked for change in really dozens of other states around the country. Fossey, one of the big problems in Maryland with Maryland politics is that we have had one political party in power in our state house, in the legislature, since 1898. And I have not researched it conclusively, but I believe that is the longest incidence of one-party rule in any jurisdiction in the Western Hemisphere. Mm-hmm. I'm working on Asia, Africa, and Europe, but I really think it's a unique phenomenon. And when you have one party in control, in the majority for that long a period of time, it's 112 years. Things just get lazy. The formalities, the checks and balances that are important to a democracy tend to break down into the traditions and the shaking hands and patting people on the back and who you know. And I think to tackle the really serious problems our state is facing, that system of checks and balances, which are so important in other states around the country, needs to be restored.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Mike. In the upcoming year, the state has to make $1 billion in budget cuts. How do you think this is going to be the best way to go about this challenge?
This is going to be a huge problem, Fossey. And the reason it's going to be so difficult is because we've seen this crisis coming. It's called a structural budget crisis. In other words, we know that for a number of years now, Maryland has consistently taken in less in tax revenue than we've mandated in spending programs. And there are a handful of very large spending mandates that are going to have to be dealt with. And the incumbents simply have not done this. I mean, what happened last year? The budget crisis was all over the news, and the incumbents, the O'Malley administration said, well, yes, we've solved it, we've made this cuts. But when I went in there and looked at it and spoke to the minority leadership, it was pretty clear that most of these quote unquote cuts were really accounting tricks, sort of like the federal government does when they say, yes, we're going to balance the budget every year, but the deficit grows. What happened that was a particular concern to me was we have a number of what are called trust funds. Mm-hmm. When in the past the legislature has said, we want to dedicate certain new taxes to certain projects, education, highways, restoring the Bay, for example, because we think those projects are important, and we don't think that raising taxes for general revenues is justified. And what happened in this last session, and this really disturbed me, was there was a systematic, I mean, you could almost call it looting of these funds. They went right down through them and said, well, they were nice to have, but this year we've got a problem and we're going to use them to pay the bills. I mean, it's kind of like dipping into your retirement fund or your kid's college fund, maybe it would be more like it, to pay for your new sports car. And I am very concerned that unless we see, a shift in the balance of power in the legislature, an increase in representation from the minority Republicans, we're going to see this pattern going on until we have a big problem. And we have the example of California is a real warning sign of what can happen when you do this. When I was a child, I grew up in Southern California, and California was considered the golden state then. They had nationally ranked schools, universities, the best freeways in the country, on and on and on and on. Today, when I'm an adult, that situation has flipped almost completely over. And one of the big problems was that California decided that they were going to enact these very large entitlement programs and not worry about paying for them until decades, sometimes even generations down the road. And we have this problem here in Maryland today. The number one problem which has to be dealt with is our state employees and teachers' pension funds. I believe, and again, it's hard to get an exact figure, because it's such a controversial issue, that the total unfunded liability for these pension funds, in other words, pensions that we are as taxpayers are required to pay out at some point in the future, and generally not so far off, at $33 billion. $33 billion in unfunded liabilities, on top of what has been paid in every year. In other words, over a number of years, the incumbents, the Democratic majority, has said, we're going to enact these and we're not going to worry about paying them. That works out to, I've heard one estimate, at $19,000 per tax-paying household in Maryland. Rich, poor, in between, that's what it would take from the taxpayers to pay this off. And this is a huge problem. It's become a disaster in California. I mean, they are cutting services, laying off state employees, civil servants, right and left, and the teachers, the civil servants that counted on these funds are very worried because they're afraid, in their old age, their income may be at risk. What we have to do, and in some sense it's sort of similar to reforms that the federal government is going to have to make with Social Security, are to convert our entitlement-based pension programs over to pay-as-you-go programs, sort of like the 401k programs that private taxpayers have, so that the state will have to pay in each year, with the cooperation and the savings of the state employee, an amount needed to fund that person's retirement living. Because if we don't make this transition, especially with our newer and our younger employees, we're going to end up in a situation where there could be no retirement checks at all. Either that, or the taxpayers will have to experience drastic draconian cuts in basic services simply in order to fund these overhanging pension benefits. Other sorts of areas, I mean, they're very close to many people, but this is where the deficit is. For example, the the Thornton education programs, which were set up. I mean, the goal was as laudable and as important as you could think of.